rise while others give up. There is a moment no one prepares you for. It doesn't arrive at the beginning of belief when everything feels new and charged with meaning. And it doesn't arrive at the end when clarity finally settles in. It arrives in the middle, after you've waited longer than you planned to, after you've stayed faithful past the point where it made sense, after the silence stopped feeling temporary and started feeling personal. This is the moment when two people, both sincere, both committed, both worn down by the same pressure, stand in the same place and take different paths. One rises, the other gives up. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. And what separates them has almost nothing to do with strength. By this stage, strength is already exhausted. What separates them is interpretation. Because when pressure lingers, the mind begins to explain it. And the explanation you accept becomes the future you walk into. Giving up rarely feels like quitting. That's why it works. It feels like maturity. It feels like realism. It feels like finally being honest with yourself. Maybe this wasn't meant for me. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe this is a sign to stop trying. Those thoughts don't arrive as attacks. They arrive as relief. And that is what makes this moment dangerous. Because there is a kind of pressure that doesn't mean no. It means threshold. Ancient wisdom understood this, even if modern language has forgotten it. When resistance increases at the same time clarity disappears, it is not because the path is wrong, it is because the path is narrowing. This is where belief stops being emotional and becomes positional. Earlier, faith was fueled by feeling, hope, inspiration, momentum. But feelings cannot carry you through thresholds. They fluctuate too easily. So something else is required. And that something is not effort. Effort carried you here. Effort got you through the waiting, the delay, the unanswered questions. But here, effort begins to betray you. You push harder and feel emptier. You double down and feel strangely misaligned. You do more and feel less settled. Many mistake this for burnout. It isn't. It's a signal that the strategy has changed. What carried you to the edge cannot carry you through it. This is where most people fight the test and lose. They argue with it. They resist it. They try to overpower it with intensity, logic, or force of will. But the test is not opposing you. It is revealing you. It exposes where you still cling to control, to guarantees, to needing proof before commitment. And every time you fight the pressure, you confirm that you're still trying to manage the outcome instead of standing inside the process. Those who rise do something that looks passive from the outside but requires immense discipline on the inside. They stop negotiating. They don't demand clarity. They don't threaten to leave. They don't rehearse exit strategies just in case. They stay, not with excitement, not with certainty, with resolve. Resolve is different from hope. Hope depends on what might happen. Resolve depends on who you have decided to be. And once resolve settles in, the test begins to lose its leverage. This is the moment few can describe because nothing dramatic happens. There is no breakthrough, no reward, no visible shift. Just a quiet internal decision. Even if nothing changes today, I will not retreat from who I've become. That sentence, spoken internally, often without words, is where rising actually begins. And this is why giving up feels most tempting right here. The desire to quit peaks just before quitting is no longer required. Pressure intensifies not to break you, but to clarify you, to strip away every conditional part of your commitment until only alignment remains. Many leave here convinced they failed. They didn't fail. They exited early. There's an old story passed down quietly, never written, only remembered. Two people entered the same season of waiting. Same hunger, same questions, same sense that something meaningful was unfolding. They stood under the same weight. But inside, their conversations with themselves began to change. One said, "This is harder than I expected." The other said, "This is different than I imagined." That single shift changed everything. Waiting gives the mind time to narrate. And the story you tell yourself in delay becomes the future you inhabit. The first person narrated loss. "I'm falling behind. Others are moving forward. I must have missed my moment." The second narrated formation. "Something is being shaped. I'm being slowed for a reason. I don't see it yet, but I feel it." Neither story was confirmed. Neither was disproven. But both were lived in. And you always become what you repeatedly live inside. The turning point didn't come with thunder. It came on an ordinary day when nothing happened. The first person woke up heavy, embarrassed by their own persistence. They decided, quietly, reasonably, to move on. Friends affirmed the choice. Life felt lighter almost immediately, and that relief felt like peace. But what followed wasn't peace. It was drift. Not pain, not despair. Drift. A subtle loss of direction that doesn't hurt enough to confront. Drift feels calm while it's happening. And that's why it's dangerous. Unfinished thresholds leave echoes. The question followed them, not accusing, just present. What if I stayed one more season? Meanwhile, the one who stayed felt no relief at all. Staying felt exposed, bare, justified by nothing. But slowly something changed. They stopped measuring time, stopped scanning for signs, stopped asking when, not because answers arrived, but because panic left. The storm didn't end, but it stopped deciding their posture. Time, it turns out, is not neutral. It rewards alignment and exposes avoidance. What you abandon unfinished returns as confusion. What you remain with returns as understanding. This is why some people face the same test again and again. Different names, different places, same weight. Unfinished lessons repeat, not as punishment, but as persistence. And this is why those who rise don't seem impressive from the outside. No dramatic leap, no announcement, just clarity, consistency, a quiet sense of completion. They didn't conquer the test, they outgrew it. And once something is completed, it no longer needs to return. That is the difference. Not belief, not effort, completion. And if this feels uncomfortably close, it's because you're not hearing a theory. You're recognizing a moment. The question now is not whether the pressure will lift. It's whether you will stay long enough to finish what this moment came to form in you. Most people never realize this part until years later. They assume the ones who rose were spared something, less pressure, fewer doubts, an easier road. But that isn't true. The weight did not lift for them any sooner. The questions did not suddenly answer themselves. What changed was not the situation, but the way the situation was allowed to exist inside them. There comes a point where continuing no longer feels heroic. It feels dull, repetitive, almost pointless. And that's exactly why it works as a filter. Because drama attracts crowds, but consistency reveals identity. Those who give up often do so because they are tired of feeling foolish for staying, tired of explaining themselves, tired of holding a position that produces no visible reward. They don't leave because they stop believing. They leave because they got tired of being unseen. And that exhaustion is understandable. But here's the part that rarely gets spoken aloud. This stage was never designed to be witnessed. If applause were present, ego would take credit. If validation were constant, resolve would weaken. If reassurance were frequent, alignment would be unnecessary. So the process removes witnesses. Not as punishment, as protection. This is why the loneliest stretch often precedes the most stable ground. Not the most exciting ground, the most stable. Those who rise begin to notice something subtle. The urge to explain themselves fades. The need to justify why they're still standing dissolves. They don't announce their commitment because they are no longer negotiating it. Silence becomes easier to live inside. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, life responds. Not with fireworks. With alignment. Conversations begin to shift. Opportunities arrive without force. Decisions that once felt heavy start to feel obvious. Not easy, obvious. The path doesn't widen. You fit it. This is why rising often looks unimpressive to others. There's no sharp contrast moment. No cinematic turning point. Just a person who no longer flinches when pressure shows up. Meanwhile, those who left often stay busy. They move quickly into new plans, new explanations, new identities, and on the surface, they seem fine. But beneath the motion, something lingers. Not regret. Regret is loud. This is quieter. It's a sense of incompletion. They may succeed elsewhere. They may even be happier, but when life slows down, late at night, in still moments and unexpected pauses, the old question resurfaces. Not what if I failed, but what if I finished? And that question carries weight because it doesn't accuse, it invites. Some answer it years later. Some never do. But the ones who rise answer it in real time. They answer it by staying when staying produces nothing but integrity. By holding position when no outcome is guaranteed. By allowing the process to complete its work instead of escaping the discomfort it uses to shape them. This is the difference that never shows up in comparisons. One path accumulates motion. The other accumulates coherence. And coherence outlasts momentum every time. Eventually, the test does release its grip. Not suddenly, but decisively. The same pressure that once felt overwhelming loses relevance. It doesn't disappear. It just no longer has authority. You don't celebrate this moment. You recognize it. You realize you're no longer asking the same questions, no longer circling the same doubts, no longer bargaining with the same fears. Something has closed, and closed things don't drain energy. They give it back. This is why some people seem quietly grounded no matter what they face. It's not because they are untouched by struggle. It's because they've completed the ones that mattered most. They don't rise because they avoided giving up. They rise because they stayed long enough to finish. And if you're still listening to this, still present with these words, it's likely because you're standing in a moment that hasn't finished with you yet. Not to break you, not to punish you, but to position you. The question isn't whether you're tired, you are. The question is whether you'll let tiredness make the decision for you, or whether you'll stay just long enough for the work to complete. Because once it does, this test won't follow you anymore. And what comes next won't require the same kind of strength. It will require the kind you're quietly building right now. There's a quiet irony to this stage that few notice while they're inside it. The moment you stop trying to force movement, movement begins to reorganize around you. Not because you relaxed your standards, not because you lowered your expectations, but because you stopped resisting the shaping. Most people believe pressure exists to be escaped, but there is a kind of pressure that exists to form weight-bearing strength. Remove it too early, and the structure looks fine until life leans on it. This is why some people seem confident for a while after they give up. They feel lighter because the pressure is gone. But light structures don't last under load. Those who stay don't feel lighter at first. They feel heavier, but steadier. And steadiness is invisible until it's needed. Over time, a subtle exchange takes place. What once drained you begins to sharpen you. What once confused you begins to clarify you. What once felt like opposition begins to feel like refinement. You're not becoming someone new. You're becoming less divided. Earlier, part of you wanted the outcome, while another part wanted safety. Part of you wanted meaning, while another part wanted relief. Those parts argued constantly, exhausting you. Completion quiets that argument. When alignment settles in, energy returns, not as excitement, but as availability. You have more room inside yourself. Decisions don't splinter you the way they used to. This is why the people who rise don't rush. They no longer need to prove motion. They trust placement. And placement changes how life approaches you. Instead of chasing confirmation, confirmation begins to meet you where you stand, not always in the way you expected, but in ways that make sense once they arrive. This is also why comparisons lose their power here. You stop measuring yourself against people who left because you're no longer walking the same internal terrain. They optimize for relief. You optimize for coherence. Both are understandable. Only one is complete. And completeness carries a calm authority. Not loud, not defensive, not fragile. Just settled. There will still be challenges ahead. This isn't the end of struggle. But it is the end of the struggle. The one that asked whether you would abandon yourself for comfort or remain present long enough to be shaped. That question, once answered, doesn't return. And that is what rising really is. Not elevation above others. Not exemption from difficulty. But freedom from repeating the same unfinished moment. So if you're still here, still listening, still feeling the weight of this, understand something important. You are not late. You are not broken. You are not failing faith. You are standing in the narrowest part of the path. And the fact that you haven't left yet tells a story about you that circumstances can't erase. Stay. Not forever, just long enough. Because what finishes here will carry you into what comes next, without dragging this weight behind you. And when that happens, you won't need anyone to tell you that you rose. You'll feel it in the quiet confidence of no longer being pulled backward by the same question. That is how you'll know this chapter is complete. And once that pull releases, something unexpected happens. You don't rush forward. Most people imagine that when a season ends, momentum explodes, that doors fly open, that everything suddenly accelerates. But that isn't how completion announces itself. It announces itself through ease of movement. Things that once required effort no longer do. Choices that once felt tangled untangle themselves. You stop overthinking steps that used to paralyze you. Not because life became simpler, but because you did. This is the part almost no one talks about because it doesn't sell drama. Completion makes you ordinary again. Not ordinary in potential, ordinary in peace. You stop needing to prove depth. Stop needing to explain pain. Stop needing to reference what you survived. The struggle no longer defines your voice. And that's when others begin to lean toward you. Not because you're louder, but because you're stable. People trust stability. They may not admire it loudly. They may not praise it publicly, but they feel it. This is why those who rise often become anchors without trying. Others sense that they're not reactive, not brittle, not constantly negotiating with fear. They're not rushing to escape discomfort or chasing reassurance. They've already answered that question. And questions, once answered honestly, stop draining energy. Meanwhile, the world continues exactly as it always has. Noise persists. Pressure cycles repeat for others. New crises replace old ones. And you'll watch people reach the same crossroads you once stood in. Some will ask for advice. You won't give speeches. You'll simply say less than expected and stand the way you stand. And that will say everything. Because the truest instruction is embodied, not explained. This is why ancient wisdom rarely shouted. It assumed that those who needed to hear it would recognize themselves in it. Everyone else would pass by. Rising doesn't make you special. It makes you available. Available to build without constantly repairing yourself. Available to face new challenges without dragging old ones forward. Available to hold weight without collapsing inward. And that availability changes what life entrusts to you. Not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably. Because life does not give its heavier assignments to people who abandon themselves when things grow unclear. It gives them to those who stay, not because they are fearless, but because they are finished with this particular fear. So if you're still listening, let this land gently. You don't need a sign tonight. You don't need reassurance. You don't need to feel strong. You only need to recognize where you are. This is not the moment to escape. It's the moment to complete. And completion is quieter than giving up, but far more powerful. Stay long enough for the season to close itself, because once it does, it won't ask you the same question again. And what comes next will not require you to prove your faith. It will assume it and build on it. If this journey has helped you understand the moment you're standing in, let it travel further than you can. Like the video so it reaches those quietly carrying the same weight. Share it with someone who feels stuck but he can't explain why. And subscribe, because the next chapter will take us into the final test before breakthrough, where what's been forming in silence is finally revealed. Until then, stay where you are. Not forever, just long enough. And even after all of this is understood, even after the words settle and the meaning feels clear, something important remains. Understanding does not end the test. Recognition does. There is a subtle difference between knowing what this moment is and inhabiting it. Many people can describe thresholds. Fewer are willing to stand inside one without trying to escape it. Because standing still, truly still, is uncomfortable in a world trained to move at the first sign of pressure. But this is where the last layer forms, not in action, not in achievement, but in restraint. The restraint to not rush forward just to feel alive. The restraint to not retreat just to feel safe. The restraint to let something finish shaping you before you carry it into what comes next. This restraint doesn't look impressive. It won't be celebrated. It won't be noticed by most people. But it will be felt by you. You'll notice it when familiar fears stop having urgency, when old doubts knock and you don't rush to answer, when silence no longer feels like abandonment, but like space. This is when the inner noise finally drops below the surface. And in that quiet, something becomes possible that wasn't before. Discernment. Not intuition fueled by emotion. Not decision-making driven by urgency. Discernment that moves slowly, confidently, without apology. This is why those who rise don't rush into the next chapter of their lives. They don't need to. They're no longer trying to escape the last one. They move forward without dragging the residue of unfinished questions behind them. And that changes everything. Because life responds differently to people who are no longer divided within themselves. It doesn't become easier, but it becomes cleaner. Fewer false starts, fewer detours that drain energy, fewer cycles that repeat the same lesson in a different disguise. Not because you learned the lesson intellectually, but because you completed it existentially. And completion carries authority. Not authority over others, authority over your own reactions, your own fears, your own tendency to abandon yourself when clarity is delayed. This is what rising really grants you. Not exemption from struggle, but exemption from this struggle. So if you feel like this chapter has been speaking directly to you, understand this. You are not being tested to see if you are worthy. You are being tested to see if you will stay present long enough to become congruent. Because what comes next, what truly comes next, cannot rest on a divided foundation. And that is why this moment matters more than it looks like it should. Stay. Let it finish. Let the quiet do its work. Because when this season finally releases you, it won't do so with noise or proof. It will do so with peace. And peace, once earned this way, does not leave easily. This is how some rise while others give up, not by being stronger, but by being willing to remain whole, when leaving would have been easier. And when that peace settles in, it doesn't arrive like a feeling you can cling to. It arrives like a baseline. You notice it most when something that once would have shaken you doesn't. A delay happens, and your chest doesn't tighten. An answer doesn't come, and you don't spiral. Someone doubts you, and it doesn't infect you. Not because you've become numb, but because you're no longer internally arguing with reality. That argument used to drain you more than the circumstances ever did. You were constantly negotiating. Should I stay? Should I go? Should this be easier by now? Am I foolish for still being here? Completion ends the negotiation. And when the negotiation ends, energy returns. This is why those who rise often seem to regain strength without changing their circumstances. They didn't receive more resources. They stopped leaking them. Inner leakage is subtle. It looks like overthinking, like second-guessing, like constantly re-evaluating commitments that were already made. When that stops, life feels lighter, not because the load is gone, but because it's finally being carried properly. This is also when memory reorganizes itself. You stop replaying past moments as evidence against yourself. You stop rewriting history to justify staying or leaving. You stop needing to make your story sound acceptable. Your past integrates instead of arguing with your present. And integration is what gives you depth without heaviness. People who give up often remain haunted not by what happened, but by what was never finished. Their memory stays fragmented. Certain chapters never settle. But when you stay long enough for something to complete, the memory closes cleanly. It no longer asks to be revisited. This is why rising brings a quiet confidence that doesn't need storytelling. You don't need to explain what you survived. You don't need to defend why you stayed. You don't need to convince anyone that it mattered. You know? And knowing, when it comes from completion, doesn't demand agreement. At some point, you'll realize that the season you thought was breaking you was actually teaching you how to remain intact under pressure, not untouched, not unaffected, intact. And that changes how you enter every future challenge. You won't panic as quickly. You won't rush to escape discomfort. You won't abandon yourself at the first sign of ambiguity. Because you've already lived through a moment where staying felt unreasonable, and you stayed anyway. That memory becomes internal ballast. It keeps you upright when the waters are rough. This is why some people seem unshakable later in life. Not because they avoided storms, but because they finished the ones that mattered most. And if you're still listening now, still allowing these words to sit with you, understand this gently. You are not being asked to stay forever. You are being asked to stay until the work is done. Leaving early always feels like relief. Staying long enough always feels like transformation. And transformation doesn't shout. It stabilizes. So let this chapter settle in you the way it's meant to. Not as motivation, not as pressure, but as recognition. You are closer than you think, not to escape, but to completion. And once something is complete, it no longer has power over you. That is how some believers rise while others give up, not because they were chosen differently, but because they stayed long enough to become different. And after that realization settles, after you stop measuring progress by noise or speed, another shift begins to take shape. You stop asking whether this season was worth it. That question only belongs to people who are still halfway out the door. Once something completes, it no longer needs justification. You don't ask whether breathing was worth it. You don't ask whether learning to stand was worth the falls. Completion removes the need to evaluate the past. And that freedom is subtle but powerful. Because so much exhaustion comes not from what we're carrying, but from constantly deciding whether we should still be carrying it. When that decision ends, strength returns. This is why the ones who rise don't suddenly become fearless. They still feel uncertainty. They still encounter resistance. But they don't interpret those moments as verdicts about who they are or whether they belong. They've already crossed that line. They no longer confuse difficulty with disqualification. That confusion is what drains most people. Every challenge becomes a referendum. Every delay feels like rejection. Every unanswered question feels personal. Completion dissolves that pattern. You begin to see difficulty as movement, not judgment. Delay as shaping, not denial. Silence as space, not abandonment. And once that lens changes, the world itself seems to respond differently. Not because it changed, but because you're no longer fighting it internally. Life meets you where you stand. This is also why rising often brings humility instead of pride. You know how close you came to leaving. You know how easy it would have been to choose relief instead of integrity. So there's no arrogance in staying, only gratitude. Gratitude that you didn't rush past something essential. Gratitude that you let the discomfort finish its work. Gratitude that you didn't abandon yourself when leaving would have been simpler. That gratitude becomes quiet strength. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need validation. It simply steadies you. And steadiness is rare. Most people are driven by urgency or avoidance. They're either running towards something or away from something. Very few are grounded where they are. But grounded people change the atmosphere around them. They don't escalate tension. They don't absorb chaos. They don't collapse under ambiguity. They move with intention because they are no longer internally fragmented. This is why the ancient path always narrowed before it widened, not to exclude, but to refine. Because what comes next requires coherence, not just conviction. It requires someone who won't fracture when clarity fades, someone who won't retreat when effort stops working, someone who won't trade alignment for relief. That is who rises, not the loudest, not the most confident, not the most certain, but the one who stayed when staying made no sense, and let the moment finish shaping them. If you've made it this far, let that land. You're not listening to this by accident. Something in you recognizes this terrain, and recognition is often the final confirmation you're given. Not a sign, not an answer, but a knowing. Stay with that knowing, because what comes after this chapter will not ask you to prove your faith again. It will assume it and build from there. And when life begins to build from that place, it does so differently than before. Not faster, not louder, but cleaner. You'll notice that fewer things feel urgent, not because they're unimportant, but because you no longer mistake urgency for meaning. You've learned the difference the hard way. Before, urgency pulled you forward. Now, alignment draws you. And what draws you never exhausts you the way what pushes you does. This is why the ones who rise don't seem frantic about the future. They plan, they move, they act, but there's no desperation underneath it. No fear of falling behind. No constant checking to see if they're still on track. They trust placement more than pace. They know that being in the right place slowly will always outperform being in the wrong place quickly. This trust didn't come from optimism. It came from surviving ambiguity without abandoning themselves. That experience rewires something deep. You stop asking, what if I'm wrong? Every time resistance appears, you start asking, what is this shaping? And that single shift turns obstacles into information instead of threats. You also become more selective. Not because you're closed, but because you're clear. You don't chase every opportunity. You don't react to every opinion. You don't absorb every emotion in the room. Your inner space has weight now, substance. And substance repels chaos without effort. This is why rising doesn't make life noisier. It makes it quieter, not empty. Quiet in the way a well-built structure is quiet under load. Things can lean on it. This is also where compassion deepens. You stop judging people who gave up. You understand how close you were to doing the same. You know the relief they felt. You know how convincing it sounded. And you know how heavy staying felt in comparison. So there's no superiority here. Only clarity. You see, the people don't quit because they're weak. They quit because the moment asked for something they weren't ready or willing to give yet. And that doesn't make them bad. It just means the lesson remains open. Some will return to it later. Some won't. Your work is not to decide for them. Your work is to remain faithful to what you've completed. Because completion carries responsibility. Not the burden of perfection, but the responsibility of presence, of showing up whole instead of fragmented, of not reenacting old fears in new situations. This is where faith matures. It stops being about reassurance and becomes about orientation. You don't need constant reminders of why you believe. You know where you're standing. And standing, once stabilized, doesn't require constant explanation. So if you're still with this, still letting these words breathe inside you, take this as a quiet affirmation. You didn't stay because you were stubborn. You didn't stay because you were afraid to leave. You stayed because something in you recognized that this moment was formative. And formative moments are not meant to be rushed. They are meant to be finished. That is why some believers rise while others give up. Not because one group was loved more, not because one group was tested less, but because one group stayed long enough to let the test complete its work. And once that work is done, life does not ask the same question again. It moves on with you. And when life moves on with you, you begin to notice something else, something almost unsettling in its simplicity. The pressure that once defined your days no longer introduces itself, not because you escaped it, but because it no longer recognizes you as someone it can move. This is the quiet authority that comes from completion. You don't announce it. You don't feel it as power. You feel it as non-reactivity. Situations arise that once would have triggered urgency, fear, or self-doubt, and now they pass through you without taking hold. You still respond. You still care. But you are no longer pulled out of position. That is when you realize something important. The test was never about whether you could endure pain. It was about whether pain could dictate your identity. And once that question is answered, it doesn't need to be asked again. This is why rising often comes with a strange sense of normalcy. You expected fireworks. Instead, you find yourself simply living, working, choosing, showing up, without the internal friction that once made everything feel heavier than it needed to be. Peace doesn't feel dramatic. It feels usable. You can build with it, carry responsibility with it, hold complexity without collapsing. This is why what comes next often looks ordinary to others. They don't see the internal shift that made it possible. They only see the results and assume you were always like this. You weren't. You were formed here, in the quiet stretch where staying felt unreasonable, in the silence where no one clapped, in the pressure that asked you to either abandon yourself or become whole, and you chose wholeness. Not perfectly, not bravely every day, but consistently enough. That consistency is what changed you. And it will continue to change you, because once you learn how to finish a season, you never approach the next one the same way. You don't rush in trying to prove yourself. You don't hesitate waiting for permission. You enter grounded. And grounded people do not need constant reassurance to keep moving. So if there is one thing to hold from this chapter, let it be this. The moment you are in is not asking for more effort. It is asking for completion. Not more belief, not more striving, but presence without escape. Stay long enough for the shaping to finish. Because when it does, you won't feel like you survived something. You'll feel like you finally stopped fighting yourself. And that, more than any breakthrough, is what allows some to rise while others give up. Not because the path was different, but because the staying was. And once you stop fighting yourself, the world stops feeling like something you have to outrun. You realize how much of your exhaustion was never about circumstances at all. It was about the constant internal split. One part of you trying to move forward, another part quietly preparing an exit, in case things didn't work out. That split kept you tense, alert, always bracing. Completion closes that gap. You no longer live half committed, half protected. You're either present or you're not, and now you are. This is why your responses begin to slow down. Not because you're uncertain, but because you're no longer reactive. You don't need to answer everything immediately. You don't need to prove awareness or intelligence or resolve. You listen longer. You choose more carefully. You move when it's time, not when anxiety demands it. This is the kind of maturity that can't be taught directly. It has to be lived into. And it changes how you relate to failure. Failure no longer threatens your identity. It becomes information, feedback, a signal, not a sentence. You don't collapse inward when something doesn't work. You adjust without self-betrayal. People who give up often fear failure because it confirms their worst suspicions about themselves. People who rise have already faced that fear and stayed anyway. They've learned that worth is not negotiated at every obstacle. That lesson alone frees enormous energy. You'll notice it when you stop replaying conversations, when you stop rehearsing defenses in your head, when you stop needing to be understood by everyone. You become harder to provoke, not because you're indifferent, but because you're anchored. Anchored people don't drift when the emotional weather changes. This is also where patience deepens, not as waiting, but as trust in process. You're no longer counting days or measuring progress against imaginary timelines. You've learned that real formation doesn't announce its schedule. It unfolds when conditions are met. And one of those conditions is you staying long enough for the work to complete. This is why the ones who rise don't look frantic when others panic. They've already lived through a season where panic offered no advantage. They've learned that urgency is often a poor guide. They move with intention instead. That intention isn't loud. It doesn't need to convince. It simply directs. And direction, once clear, simplifies everything else. Choices narrow. Distractions lose appeal. You don't feel pulled in 100 directions because you're no longer undecided about who you are. This doesn't make life small. It makes it focused. And focus multiplies impact quietly. You won't always notice it happening. Others might notice before you do. They'll comment on your calm, your steadiness, your clarity. You won't take credit. You'll know where it came from. It came from a season you didn't escape, a moment you didn't abandon, a question you answered by staying. And that answer keeps answering for you long after the season ends. That is why this chapter matters. Not because it feels profound, but because it closes something. And closed things stop draining you. They give you back to yourself. That is what rising really gives. Not elevation above others, but the ability to stand fully present in your own life, without needing to run, hide, or explain. And once you have that, everything that comes next has somewhere solid to land. And from that solid ground, you begin to notice how differently you carry weight. Responsibility and responsibilities don't feel like threats anymore. Decisions don't feel like traps. Even uncertainty loses its edge. You don't need every variable controlled before you move. You've already lived through a season where control wasn't available, and you remained intact. That experience becomes reference. When something new challenges you, your body remembers. I've been here before. Not in this form, but in this feeling. And because you didn't collapse then, you don't assume collapse now. This is how inner history becomes strength. Not by remembering victories, but by remembering survival without self-abandonment. Most people don't realize how often they leave themselves in difficult moments. They detach emotionally, compromise values quietly, or rewrite their own convictions just to make the pressure stop. Those choices bring relief, but they also leave residue. Residue shows up later as doubt, fatigue, or the sense that you can't quite trust yourself under pressure. Completion clears that residue. You stayed when staying was uncomfortable. You didn't numb out. You didn't explain yourself away. So now when you say yes, it has weight. When you say no, it has clarity. When you commit, there is no second voice preparing an exit. That integrity changes how others interact with you. They sense boundaries without you stating them. They trust your consistency without you promising it. They lean on you, not because you're strong, but because you're stable. Stability attracts responsibility. And responsibility, when met by someone who is whole, doesn't crush. It refines. This is why rising often leads to quieter influence rather than louder visibility. You're not seeking attention. You're available for impact. And impact doesn't always look impressive in the moment. Sometimes it looks like being the calm presence when things unravel. Sometimes it looks like choosing patience when urgency would be applauded. Sometimes it looks like walking away from noise without needing to announce why. These choices are subtle, but subtle things shape lives. You also begin to recognize the moment others are standing where you once stood. You hear it in their words. You see it in their restlessness. And you don't rush to fix them or convince them. You know this terrain can't be crossed by advice. It can only be crossed by staying. So you offer presence instead of pressure. You listen without judgment. You don't glamorize endurance, but you don't minimize it either. You respect the moment for what it is, because you remember how close you were to leaving. And that memory keeps you grounded, not proud. This is the quiet legacy of completion. It doesn't make you louder. It doesn't make you harder. It makes you real. And real people don't need to perform faith. They live it, steady, imperfect, and whole. So if you feel like this chapter has been slowly closing something inside you, that's not imagination. That's recognition. You are not waiting for permission to move forward. You are waiting for something to finish forming. And finishing doesn't happen by force. It happens by presence. Stay present. Let the season close itself, because once it does, you won't be pulled backward by the same uncertainty again. You'll move forward, not rushed, not hesitant, but rooted. And rooted people don't give up easily. They don't need to. And being rooted changes how you experience time itself. You stop feeling like you're racing against something invisible. The days no longer feel like a countdown to proof or failure. Time becomes something you move with, not something you're trying to outrun. This is when patience stops feeling like waiting and starts feeling like confidence. You're no longer anxious about whether things will work out. You're attentive to how things are unfolding. There's a difference. Anxiety wants conclusions. Attentiveness notices formation. And formation has its own rhythm. You begin to sense when to act and when to hold. Not because you received instructions, but because you're no longer internally noisy. When the mind quiets, timing becomes clearer. This is why those who rise don't mistake stillness for stagnation. They understand that some growth happens below the surface, strengthening roots that will later support weight no one sees coming yet. They also stop romanticizing struggle. They don't seek hardship to prove devotion. They don't cling to difficulty as if it makes them special. They simply don't run from it when it arrives. That balance, neither chasing pain nor fleeing it, is rare. And it's powerful, because it keeps you honest. You're not staying to earn something. You're staying because leaving would fracture you. That clarity removes drama from the decision. And without drama, endurance becomes sustainable. This is why giving up often looks attractive. It offers immediate relief without requiring integration. But relief without integration always comes at a cost later. Staying asks more in the moment, but less over a lifetime. It consolidates lessons instead of scattering them. It closes loops instead of leaving them open. It builds continuity inside you so you're not constantly restarting yourself in new chapters. And continuity is strength. You feel it when you face a new challenge and realize you're not starting from zero. You're bringing something with you, something earned quietly. You're bringing coherence. That coherence becomes a kind of inner compass. It doesn't shout directions. It gently resists what doesn't belong and draws you toward what does. And that guidance feels different from impulse. It's calmer, more patient, more precise. You trust it because it was forged in a season where trust was tested. So if this chapter has felt slow, that's intentional. Formation is slow. It has to be. Anything that shapes the core cannot be rushed without breaking something important. You are not behind because things took time. You are prepared because they did. And when the moment comes to step into what follows, when the next chapter of your life opens, you will enter it differently than you would have before. Not as someone seeking validation, not as someone bracing for collapse, but as someone who knows what it means to stay. That knowledge will steady you when excitement fades. It will anchor you when clarity dips. It will remind you, without words, that you've already crossed the threshold that once felt impossible. And thresholds once crossed don't need to be crossed again. This is the quiet gift of this season. It doesn't give you answers. It gives you completion. And completion gives you back your strength, not as force, but as presence. Stay with that presence. Let it carry you forward. Because what rises from this place doesn't burn out easily. It lasts. And lasting changes the way you imagine the future. You stop picturing it as something you must conquer or unlock. It no longer feels like a door you're pounding on, hoping it opens before you lose heart. It begins to feel like a landscape you're already walking into, step by step, without ceremony. This is where expectation softens. Not because you expect less, but because you trust more. You trust that what's meant to meet you will do so without you chasing it into exhaustion. You trust that what requires force is rarely the thing meant to shape you next. And you trust yourself enough now to recognize the difference. That trust was not given to you. It was earned in a season where there was no applause for staying, no reassurance for enduring, no visible reward for consistency. Only the quiet choice, repeated again and again, not to abandon yourself. This is why the ones who rise don't glamorize their story afterward. They don't need to. The story did its work inside them. It doesn't need to be retold to prove anything. They also don't fear future tests the way they once did. Not because tests stop coming, but because they've learned how to recognize them. They know the difference between a challenge that asks for action and a threshold that asks for presence. Most people fail thresholds by trying to do something. Those who rise learn when the work is to be something. Be steady. Be aligned. Be whole. That discernment saves years of unnecessary struggle. It prevents you from fighting what is shaping you and chasing what isn't meant for you yet. It keeps you from exhausting yourself in the wrong battles while missing the quiet work happening underneath. This is why your pace naturally changes. You're not slower because you're uncertain. You're slower because you're accurate. Accuracy requires stillness. Precision requires patience. And patience, once learned this way, is no longer fragile. It doesn't collapse under delay. It doesn't sour into resentment. It holds. You'll notice this in small moments first, when something doesn't work out and you don't spiral, when plans shift and you don't immediately search for blame, when silence returns and it doesn't feel hostile. Those are signs of completion. They're subtle, but they're real. And over time they compound. You become someone who can hold complexity without fragmenting. Someone who can move forward without needing certainty to lead the way. Someone who doesn't mistake discomfort for danger. This is the kind of person life can trust with more. Not more ease, more responsibility. Not more comfort, more impact. And that trust shows up gradually. In opportunities that require steadiness. In relationships that require presence. In roles that require depth rather than speed. You won't feel ready in the way you once defined readiness. But you will feel able. Able because you've already faced a moment where quitting felt justified, and you stayed anyway. That memory doesn't make you proud. It makes you grounded. And grounded people don't rise once. They rise again and again. Not by escaping difficulty, but by completing what difficulty came to form in them. This is why some believers rise while others give up, not because one path was easier, but because one choice to stay was made long enough for it to become irreversible. And once that happens, giving up no longer feels like an option, not because you're forcing yourself forward, but because you finally know where you stand. And knowing where you stand changes how you stand everywhere else. You stop adjusting yourself to fit every situation. Stop shrinking to avoid conflict. Stop stretching beyond your limits just to be accepted. You don't harden. You stabilize. Stability doesn't argue. Doesn't defend itself loudly. It doesn't need to dominate a room to feel secure in it. It simply occupies space without apology. And that is felt. People may not understand you better, but they trust you more. Not because you explain yourself well, but because you don't contradict yourself under pressure. Your words and posture match. Your commitments and actions align. Your presence feels consistent. This is rare. Most people are fractured by the need to adapt constantly, different versions of themselves for different moments. That fragmentation is exhausting. It drains energy even on good days. Completion ends that pattern. You are no longer switching identities to survive a season. You're carrying the same center into each new one. And that center becomes home. So when uncertainty appears again, and it will, you don't feel displaced. You don't scramble to find footing. You already have it. This is why those who rise don't fear being misunderstood. They've already endured a season where no explanation helped. They learned that understanding is not something you can demand. It arrives or it doesn't. Either way, you stay. And staying without resentment is the real victory. Resentment is what poisons endurance. It turns staying into bitterness and patience into quiet anger. But when you stay with clarity instead of resentment, the pressure has nothing left to exploit. That's when it releases you. Not because you fought harder, but because you no longer needed to fight at all. You'll know this has happened when you stop replaying the season in your mind, when you stop imagining alternative endings, when you stop wondering how things might have gone if you'd chosen differently. The chapter closes, cleanly. And closed chapters don't follow you. They inform you, but they don't haunt you. This is what makes room for what comes next. Not excitement, not ambition. Space. Space inside you that was once occupied by doubt, second-guessing, and internal debate. That space doesn't stay empty for long. It becomes available for focus, creativity, and grounded action. You start building again, but this time without constantly checking whether the foundation will hold, because you know it will. It already has. So if you feel quieter now than you used to, don't mistake that for loss of passion. Passion doesn't disappear, it refines. It stops burning outward and starts burning steady. That kind of fire lasts. And it doesn't need to be fed by urgency or fear. It feeds itself. This is the difference between those who rise once and those who keep rising. One depends on circumstances. The other depends on completion. And completion is something no one can take from you once it's earned. If you're still here, still breathing with these words, let this be enough for now. You don't need to decide anything tonight. You don't need to push forward. You don't need to prove that you understood. Just recognize where you are. You are not at the beginning. You are not at the end. You are at the place where staying quietly does more than striving ever could. And that is why, when the time comes, you will rise. Not suddenly, not loudly, but permanently. And permanence changes the way you relate to doubt. Doubt still appears, but it no longer sits in the center of your decisions. It becomes a visitor, not a ruler. You listen to it without handing it the keys. Before, doubt felt dangerous because it threatened to undo everything. Now it feels informational, a signal to pause, not to retreat. You've learned that certainty is not required for integrity. Integrity only requires that you don't abandon yourself. This is why fear loses its leverage here. Fear thrives on urgency and isolation. It grows when you feel like you must decide now or be left behind. But you've already lived through a season where nothing moved quickly, and you remained whole. Fear has nothing new to threaten you with, and without threat, it quiets. You begin to notice how often people around you are being driven by fear disguised as wisdom. Fear that says, don't risk looking foolish. Fear that says, don't wait too long. Fear that says, take the exit while it's still respectable. You don't judge them for it. You recognize it. Because you've felt that voice before, and you know how convincing it sounds. But you also know where it leads. It leads to motion without meaning, to relief without resolution, to progress that eventually circles back to the same question wearing a different face. You've stepped out of that loop, and stepping out of it doesn't make you superior. It makes you quieter. You don't need to convince others to stay. You don't need to warn them what happens if they leave. Everyone has to meet their own threshold. Your work is simpler now, as remain where you are. Move when it's time. Finish what you begin. This simplicity is not naivete. It's clarity earned through pressure. And clarity simplifies life in ways ambition never can. You stop asking, what will this get me? You start asking, is this aligned with who I've become? That single question filters out countless distractions. It saves you years. This is why the ones who rise often look like they're taking fewer steps, but arriving farther. Each step carries more weight because it isn't compensating for uncertainty. They're not rushing to escape discomfort. They're moving from coherence. And coherence compounds. Small, aligned actions accumulate faster than frantic effort ever could. Quiet consistency outpaces dramatic bursts. This is the hidden advantage of staying. It doesn't just complete a season. It changes how you move through every season after it. So if there's a lingering sense in you, an almost imperceptible calm settling in, don't rush to label it. Don't demand it prove itself. Let it be what it is. It's not excitement. It's not relief. It's orientation. And once you're oriented, you don't need to be pushed forward. You'll move when it's time. Until then, stay. Not because you're afraid to leave, but because you know what leaving early costs. And you've already paid enough. This is how the chapter closes. Not with answers, not with certainty, but with a steadiness that wasn't there before. And that steadiness, earned, not borrowed, is what allows some believers to rise, while others give up, quietly, decisively, for good. And once that steadiness becomes familiar, you begin to recognize its opposite more clearly. You can feel when something is asking you to rush. You can sense when a decision is being fueled by fear rather than alignment. You can tell the difference between urgency that sharpens you and urgency that scatters you. That discernment doesn't come from intelligence. It comes from having lived through a season where rushing would have cost you everything that mattered. So now, when pressure shows up, you don't immediately interpret it as a command. You listen for what it's actually asking. Sometimes it asks for action. Sometimes it asks for patience. And sometimes, this is the hardest part, it asks for nothing at all. It asks you to remain. Remaining is not passive. Remaining is active restraint. It is the discipline of not moving just to escape discomfort. It is the strength to let a moment finish speaking before you respond. This is why remaining feels like effort at first. You're resisting old habits, habits that equated movement with safety and explanation with control. But as those habits loosen, remaining becomes natural. You stop feeling like you're holding yourself back. You start feeling like you're holding yourself together. That shift is everything. Because people who hold themselves together don't fracture under pressure. They bend, adapt, and recalibrate. But they don't abandon the center. This is what life can build on. Not raw enthusiasm. Not endless optimism. Wholeness. And wholeness attracts opportunities that fragmented people never see, not because they're better, but because they're ready. Ready to carry weight without resentment. Ready to move without panic. Ready to wait without losing themselves. You'll notice this readiness when you're no longer tempted by exits that once looked appealing. When the idea of giving up doesn't feel relieving, it feels misaligned. That's how you know the work here is done. The question that once haunted you, should I stay or should I leave, no longer has emotional charge. You've already answered it. And answers that are lived into don't need to be revisited. From here on, your challenges will ask different things of you. They'll still stretch you, still test you. But they won't ask whether you'll abandon yourself to make the discomfort stop. That test has been completed. And completed tests don't repeat. So as this chapter draws toward its close, let one thing settle deeply. You did not stay because you were afraid of change. You stayed because you recognized that leaving would cost you something irreplaceable. You stayed because something in you understood that this moment was not an obstacle. It was a forge. And what emerges from a forge isn't louder. It's stronger, quieter, truer, more capable of bearing what comes next. This is why some believers rise while others give up. not because one path was blessed more than the other, but because one choice, to remain present when escape was easier, was honored all the way to completion. And once completion is reached, the path forward opens without resistance. You don't have to push. You simply walk. And that walk, steady, unforced, and whole, is where the next chapter truly begins. And as that walk begins, you realize something quietly profound. You're no longer carrying the urgency to become someone. You are simply becoming, without pressure, without performance. Earlier, every step felt like it had to justify itself. Every decision had to prove that you were on the right path, that you hadn't wasted time, that staying had been worth it. That need was exhausting. Now the need is gone. You don't measure each moment against an imagined future. You're present enough to let the future meet you instead. This is when confidence stops being something you feel and starts being something you operate from. You don't wake up confident. You wake up clear. And clarity does more than confidence ever could. Clarity tells you what not to chase. Clarity tells you when silence is wiser than speech. Clarity tells you when patience is power. Most people never reach this point because they confuse clarity with certainty. They wait to feel sure before they stay. They wait to feel confident before they commit. But clarity comes after commitment, not before. You stayed without certainty. You remained without guarantees. And because of that, clarity arrived quietly, without needing to announce itself. This is also where comparison finally loses its grip. You stop looking sideways to see who's ahead or behind, not because you're above comparison, but because it no longer applies. You're no longer running the same internal race. Others may move faster. Others may look more successful. Others may seem more certain. But you know something they might not yet know. Speed without completion leads back to the same unfinished place. You've already been there. So you keep walking, steady, grounded, uninterested in shortcuts that cost coherence. And coherence continues to reward you in small but compounding ways. Your decisions cost less energy. Your relationships feel cleaner. Your sense of direction holds even when conditions change. You don't feel invincible. You feel available. Available to respond instead of react. Available to build instead of repair. Available to face what comes without needing to escape it. This availability is what makes the next season possible. Not talent. Not timing. Not even belief. Availability. And availability only comes when you're no longer divided inside yourself. That division was resolved here. Quietly, slowly through staying. So if there's one last thing to hold as this chapter completes, let it be this. You were never being tested to see how much you could endure. You are being invited to become someone who doesn't abandon themselves when endurance is required. That invitation has been answered. Not with words, not with emotion, but with presence. And presence, once chosen deeply enough, becomes who you are. That is why some believers rise while others give up. Not because they felt stronger, but because they stayed long enough to become stable. And stability is the one thing. The next chapter will quietly assume you have. And when stability becomes assumed rather than questioned, life begins to relate to you differently. Not dramatically, not ceremoniously, but reliably. You start to notice that fewer things knock you off balance, not because the knocks stopped coming, but because you're no longer built on temporary footing. You don't scramble to recover your sense of self after every challenge. You don't reconstruct meaning from scratch each time something goes wrong. You already know who you are in difficulty. That knowledge is expensive. It was paid for in a season where nothing reassured you except your decision to stay. And now that it's earned, it works quietly in the background of your life. This is why the ones who rise often seem less reactive as time goes on. They don't swing as wildly between hope and despair. They don't overcorrect at every obstacle. They don't need to dramatize their journey to feel that it matters. They trust the work that was done when no one was watching. That trust frees attention. You begin to focus outward again, not because you escaped inward struggle, but because it no longer demands all your energy. You have room to notice others, to build things that last, to engage without constantly protecting yourself. This is when service becomes possible without self-erasure. When contribution doesn't come from proving worth, but from having enough internal solidity to give without losing yourself. It's a subtle shift, but it changes the quality of everything you touch. Work becomes cleaner. Relationships become steadier. Decisions become less emotionally charged, not because life is easier, but because you're no longer fragile in the same way. Fragility doesn't mean weakness. It means unfinished integration. And integration happened here, quietly, gradually, through staying. This is also when gratitude deepens, not the loud kind that celebrates wins, but the quiet kind that honors survival without compromise. Gratitude that you didn't trade your center for relief, that you didn't abandon yourself to escape uncertainty. That gratitude doesn't inflate you. It grounds you. You know how close you were to leaving. You know how reasonable it would have sounded. And that memory keeps you honest. So when others ask how you stayed, you don't give instructions. You don't offer formulas. You don't pretend it was simple. You just say, less than expected. Because staying isn't something you can fully explain to someone who hasn't stood where you stood. It has to be lived. And that's okay. Your life doesn't need to persuade anyone anymore. It just needs to be lived from the place that was formed here. So as this chapter continues to settle, understand this. You are no longer standing at the threshold. You crossed it when you stayed without bargaining. What remains now is not endurance, but application, carrying what was formed here into what comes next. And what comes next will not ask whether you can survive silence, delay, or doubt. It will assume you can. It will ask something different, something heavier. And because of this chapter, you will be able to carry it without breaking. Not because you are extraordinary, but because you are finished with running from yourself. And being finished with running from yourself is more liberating than most people ever realize. You no longer spend energy bracing for collapse. You no longer scan every challenge for hidden meaning about your worth. You no longer assume that difficulty is a verdict. That assumption used to cost you more than the difficulty itself. Now, when something resists you, you don't shrink or harden. You meet it. You allow it to show you what it needs to show you. Nothing more, nothing less. This is the posture of someone who has been formed. Formed people don't need to dominate situations. They don't need to win every exchange. They don't need to be right in order to feel secure. They're not passive. They're anchored. And anchoring changes how pressure behaves around you. Pressure can still apply force, but it can't displace you. It can test, but it can't rearrange your identity. This is why you begin to trust yourself again. Not in the reckless sense, in the grounded sense. You trust your ability to stay present when things get uncomfortable. You trust that you won't abandon your values just to make the moment easier. You trust that even if you don't know what comes next, you will meet it whole. That trust is quiet, but it's strong. It replaces the need for constant reassurance. It frees you from needing others to confirm that you're doing the right thing. Their approval becomes welcome, not necessary. And necessity is what once gave their opinions too much power. Now, opinions are information, not direction. Direction comes from a deeper place, a place that was shaped here in a season where nothing external could guide you. That season did its work. So when the next challenge arrives, and it will, you won't ask the same questions you used to ask. You won't ask, is this proof I should quit? You won't ask, why is this so hard? You won't ask, did I make a mistake by staying? You'll ask something simpler. What is required of me now? And you'll wait long enough to hear the answer. This is how wisdom begins, not as information, but as timing. Wisdom knows when to act and when to remain. It knows when to push and when to hold. And it only emerges in people who have learned that not every moment is asking for motion. Some moments are asking for completion. You completed this one. Not dramatically, not perfectly, but honestly. And honesty, lived long enough, becomes strength. So as this chapter continues to close, not with noise but with integration, let this be the truth you carry forward. You did not lose time by staying. You did not fall behind by remaining. You did not miss your moment. You met it. And because you met it fully, it no longer needs to meet you again. That is why some believers rise while others give up. Not because they escaped the pressure, but because they allowed it to finish shaping them before they moved on. And once that shaping is complete, what comes next doesn't require the same kind of courage. It requires presence. And presence is something you now have. And presence, once earned, doesn't fade when conditions change. It stays with you when rooms grow unfamiliar. It stays with you when expectations rise. It stays with you when the weight of responsibility increases. That's how you know this chapter truly did its work. Because the real test of formation is not how you survive pressure, but how you carry weight afterward. Unformed people collapse under responsibility. Partially formed people resent it. Formed people carry it without losing themselves. Not because they enjoy it, but because it no longer threatens their center. You stop interpreting responsibility as a trap. You see it for what it is, evidence that something in you can be trusted. And trust, real trust, is never given to those who run when things get unclear. It's given to those who stayed. This is why your relationship with difficulty changes permanently. You don't romanticize it, but you don't fear it either. Difficulty becomes part of the terrain, not a signal to turn back. And that frees you to move with dignity. Dignity doesn't rush. Dignity doesn't beg. Dignity doesn't abandon itself to stay comfortable. Dignity stands. And standing, once learned, becomes instinct. You'll feel it when unexpected pressure arrives and your first response is not panic, not escape, not over-explanation, but stillness, a quiet assessment, a grounded response. That moment will tell you more than any affirmation ever could. It will tell you, this work is done. You didn't finish it because someone told you to. You didn't finish it because you were strong every day. You finished it because you were honest enough to stay when leaving would have fractured you. And that honesty became integrity. That integrity became stability. That stability became capacity. Capacity for what comes next. The next chapter will not look like this one. It won't ask you to endure silence in the same way. It won't test your willingness to remain without answers. It will ask something deeper. It will ask whether you can carry forward what was formed here without returning to old patterns when things get heavy again. And because of this chapter, you can, not flawlessly, not effortlessly, but faithfully. So as these words reach their natural resting point, let them do what they're meant to do. Not motivate you, not push you, but remind you. You are not someone who gives up at the edge anymore. You are someone who knows how to stay long enough for things to finish shaping you. And that knowledge, earned quietly, paid for honestly, will guide you long after this season fades from memory. This is how some believers rise while others give up, not in one dramatic moment, but in 1,000 quiet decisions to remain present, when walking away would have been easier. And once those decisions have done their work, you don't need to make them again. You simply walk forward, whole, grounded, and ready for what comes next. And as you walk forward like that, whole, grounded, unhurried, you begin to realize something else that's easy to miss. Nothing is chasing you anymore. Earlier, it felt like life was constantly closing in. Deadlines, expectations, comparisons, unanswered questions, all of it created the sense that if you didn't move fast enough, you'd be left behind. That pressure is gone now. Not because the world slowed down, but because you stopped running from yourself. Running creates the illusion of pursuit. Stillness reveals what was never chasing you in the first place. This is why the future no longer feels threatening. Unknowns remain, yes, but they don't feel hostile. They feel neutral, open, like territory rather than danger. You don't rush to define what comes next. You let it approach you at its own pace. That patience isn't passive. It's informed. It knows the cost of moving too soon. It remembers what happened when you almost left before the work was done. And memory, when integrated, becomes wisdom. So now, when opportunity appears, you don't grab it reflexively. You assess whether it aligns with what was formed here. If it does, you move without hesitation. If it doesn't, you let it pass without regret. That discernment protects you from repeating old cycles. You no longer mistake availability for direction. You no longer confuse attention with purpose. You no longer assume that every open door is yours to walk through. You've learned that some doors open to test whether you'll abandon your center again. You don't. And that restraint keeps your life cleaner than it used to be. Fewer entanglements, fewer apologies, fewer moments where you have to recover yourself afterward. This is the long-term reward of staying. Not a single breakthrough moment, but a life that requires less repair. And repair is what exhausts people most. Constantly undoing decisions made in fear. Constantly explaining compromises they didn't want to make. Constantly rebuilding trust with themselves. You stepped off that treadmill here. You didn't just survive a hard season. You resolved something. And resolved things don't come back, demanding attention. They become reference points, quiet reminders that you can remain present even when clarity is delayed, even when relief is tempting, even when no one is watching. That knowledge doesn't make you loud. It makes you steady. And steadiness has a gravity of its own. People will feel it without knowing why. Situations will respond to it without explanation. Life will place weight in your hands, not to test you, but because you can carry it now. So let this chapter end the way it began, not with answers, but with understanding. The difference between those who rise and those who give up is not found in belief, effort, or talent. It's found in one quiet decision made over and over again. To remain present when leaving would have been easier. That decision has now done its work in you. You don't need to repeat it. You only need to live from it. And when the next chapter opens, as it inevitably will, you won't enter it questioning whether you belong. You'll enter it knowing you can stay, whatever comes. And now, everything begins to quiet. Not because the journey was small, but because it has done what it came to do. There is no final surge of emotion here. No dramatic swell. No last demand placed on you. Only a settling. This is the point where the mind stops reaching forward and the body exhales. You don't need to do anything with what you've heard. You don't need to remember every line. You don't need to turn it into effort. What mattered has already landed where it needed to land. You stayed with this chapter not because it entertained you, but because it recognized you. And recognition is always quieter than motivation. So let the pace slow now. Let the urgency dissolve. If you're sitting somewhere, notice your posture. If you're listening while moving, notice your breath. There is nothing you're late for in this moment. This chapter was never about pushing you forward. It was about allowing something to finish inside you. And finishing doesn't feel explosive. It feels complete. You may notice there's no longer a question pressing you. No internal argument asking, should I stay or should I go? That question has already been answered. Not in words, but in a posture. You listen this far because something in you already chose staying. That choice doesn't need to be repeated. It doesn't need to be defended. It doesn't need to be proven. It simply becomes part of who you are now. And once something becomes part of who you are, it stops demanding attention. That's how you know a chapter is truly closed. Not when you feel excited, not when you feel victorious, but when the tension that once defined it is gone. This is that moment. You are not carrying unfinished business out of this chapter. You are carrying integration. The pressure that once asked, will you give up? No longer needs to ask. It already knows the answer. So this chapter releases you, not into ease, not into certainty, but into steadiness. And steadiness is enough for what comes next. Because the next chapter will not ask whether you can endure silence, delay, or uncertainty. It will assume you can. It will ask something deeper. It will ask what happens after staying. What happens when the moment of quitting has passed, and the only thing left is forward motion. That chapter is called The Final Test Before Breakthrough. And it is not about whether you believe. It is about whether you are ready to carry what was formed here into a world that will finally begin to respond. Before we step there, pause with this. If this chapter helped you recognize your own moment, if it helped you stay when leaving would have been easier, then let it travel, like this video, not for the algorithm, but so it reaches someone standing quietly where you once stood. Share it with someone who doesn't need advice, only recognition. And subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter of this journey. Because what comes next is not about endurance. It is about revelation. And now, this chapter is complete. And before we fully let the silence take over, one last thing needs to be said. Quietly, without urgency. Nothing you felt during this chapter was accidental. The pauses, the heaviness, sense of recognition rather than excitement. Those are signs of closure, not absence. Many people mistake closure for emptiness and rush to fill it with noise. But closure is simply space returning after tension leaves. It's the nervous system standing down. It's the mind no longer bracing. So if things feel unusually still right now, don't interrupt it. Stillness is not stagnation. It's recalibration. This is the kind of stillness that only comes after a long internal argument has ended. After a question has been answered so thoroughly that it no longer needs words. You don't need to replay this chapter. You don't need to analyze it. You don't need to extract lessons from it. What mattered has already moved beneath thought. And beneath thought is where lasting change lives. From here on, you may notice that the same pressures don't provoke the same reactions. Old triggers lose their urgency. Familiar fears knock, but without authority. That's not coincidence. That's completion. So let this be the final tone you carry forward from this chapter. You are not someone standing at the edge anymore. You are someone who knows how to remain, and that knowing is sufficient. When the next chapter begins, it won't feel like a continuation of struggle. It will feel like movement after settling, purposeful, measured, and grounded. Until then, let this ending remain exactly what it is. Not a push, not a promise, a landing. Take your time here. This chapter does not need anything more from you. And when you're ready, truly ready, the next one will be waiting. Then we let it fade, without adding weight to what has already settled. There is nothing more to carry from this chapter. Nothing to resolve, nothing to chase. What needed to be shaped has been shaped. What needed to be finished has been finished. If you feel a quiet firmness where there was once tension, that is not imagination. That is the feeling of something no longer pulling at you from behind. You don't have to name it. You don't have to explain it. It will show itself later, in the way you pause instead of panic, in the way you choose without second-guessing, in the way you stay present when uncertainty returns. And uncertainty will return. But it won't ask the same question again. That question belongs to a chapter that is now closed. So let this end the way it should end. Not with momentum, not with urgency, not with instruction, but with stillness. You're not waiting anymore. You're ready. And when the next chapter begins, you won't need to be told why. You'll feel it. And with that feeling, we don't add anything else. We don't explain it away. We don't decorate it. We don't rush to the next sound. Because endings like this only work when they're respected. If you notice a sense of quiet confidence, not excitement, not relief, but calm, that is exactly what was meant to arrive. That calm is not empty. It's stable. This is what it feels like when a chapter truly closes. No loose edges. No unresolved questions. No need to look back and check if you missed something. You didn't. The work was never in remembering the words. The work was in letting them finish something already happening inside you. So we let this stand. You go back into your life without carrying this chapter like a burden. You carry it like a foundation. Unseen but reliable. And when the next test appears, because it will, it won't ask whether you're willing to stay. That part is already settled. It will ask something else, something heavier, something quieter, something that only makes sense after staying. That is where we're going next. For now, this chapter rests, and so do you. And that's where we leave it. No echo, no final push, no unfinished thought. Just a quiet end to a chapter that did its work without needing applause. When you step away from this moment, nothing will feel dramatically different. And that's how you'll know it's real. Because real completion doesn't announce itself. It steadies you. So let this close exactly here. Not as an ending you have to remember, but as something that will remember you later, when it matters. And there's nothing more to add. Anything else would only disturb what's already settled. So we don't extend it. We don't intensify it. We don't circle back. We let the quiet do what it came to do. This chapter ends not because the words ran out, but because the work is complete. And completion doesn't need commentary. It holds. This chapter ends not with movement, but with stillness. Because stillness is what remains. When the struggle no longer needs to speak, there is nothing left to prove here. Nothing left to wrestle with. Nothing left to decide. The question that once followed you, should I stay or should I walk away, has already answered itself. Not with words, but with who you are now. And when a question is answered at that level, it doesn't return. That's how you know this chapter is complete. You don't feel excitement. You don't feel relief. You feel grounded. And grounded is enough. From this place forward, faith doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to convince. It doesn't need to brace itself against doubt. It simply stands. So let this chapter rest. Carry it quietly. Not as a memory, but as a foundation you won't have to think about it again. Because what comes next will not ask whether you can endure. It will assume you can. If this chapter helped you recognize the moment you were standing in, let it reach someone else who needs recognition more than advice. Like this video. Share it with someone who's tired of pretending they're fine. And subscribe, because the next chapter is different. The next chapter is not about staying. It's about what happens after staying. The final test before breakthrough, and it begins from solid ground.